Welcome back to It's Not Normal, the podcast, episode 14. In this week's episode, I'm going to be talking all about what it was like talking to therapists for the first time. A couple of weeks ago, I was invited to be on a podcast hosted by Katie and Helen Villers called Insight Exposing Narcissism. I had never spoken to a mental health professional before, and I did it for the first time on a podcast. And I'm really excited to talk about what the experience in general was like and also address some of the topics that we talked about throughout the episode. Before we get into it, I just want to take a minute to thank everybody who's been following along and tuning in. If you've been enjoying these episodes, please be sure to like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you're listening on Spotify, please leave us a rating. That being said, let's dive into the episode. So a couple weeks ago, I got a DM on TikTok from Katie McKenna. And I had followed Katie McKenna before. I was following both her and Helen, and I had listened to their podcast, Insight, before. And so I got this message from her. And whenever you get a DM on social media, you can see that it's a new message, that it hasn't been read. And then you see the first few words of that message. And it was just, "Hey, Casey, ... I had no idea what followed it up. And my immediate reaction was, okay, I probably said something wrong in one of my videos because I knew that she was a mental health professional, right? And I am not. I have no credentials to back it up. And so I was thinking to myself right off the bat, like I probably said something in one of my most recent videos that was inaccurate or not right or something that I shouldn't be talking about as someone who doesn't have any kind of professional background. So I did put off opening the message for a little while, but eventually I just came around to it and I opened it up. And sure enough, it wasn't anything negative. It was an invite to be on her and Helen's podcast. And so I was so excited about that and I was so flattered, especially because starting this podcast is a relatively new endeavor for me. We're only 14 episodes in, and a New Year's resolution of mine was to be a guest on a podcast at some point throughout the year. And here we are mid-January, and I was invited to be on a podcast already. So I was really stoked for that reason. And also because I have never spoken to a mental health professional before, up until, I guess, a couple of weeks ago now. But I haven't ever gone to therapy. I haven't gotten any real professional advice. Everything that I've learned has been through research that I've done or books that I've read or learning from other people's experiences and gaining some perspective from that. So I was really curious to see what it would be like to be on the receiving end of that sort of a conversation and those questions. And we did talk about in the beginning of the episode how my first reaction when I saw the message from Katie was to think that it was something negative, right? I automatically got defensive, and that was one of the first things that we dove into. And it's really interesting because I think so often the reasons that we become defensive, right? These things that trigger us to re-enter into that more defensive state. At one point in our lives, more often than not, they were used as methods of self-protection. They were survival skills. And so initially, when I saw this message and I thought, okay, maybe, I did something wrong, like I'm at fault here, right? It's important to validate that feeling and that experience because when you trace that back, right, where does this come from? There were a lot of times in my life where something popped up that I didn't know whether it was going to be good or bad. But if it ended up being bad and then time and time again it was bad, you start to anticipate negativity. And the better you get at predicting these more negative experiences, I think the better you get at protecting yourself from how badly those things might hurt. And so you're preparing yourself for this negative experience already so that you're not going into it maybe as vulnerable. And while that might have been beneficial at some point throughout our lives, as we move into adulthood and healthy relationships, that kind of mentality doesn't necessarily serve us anymore. And so that was one of the first things that we talked about. And it was a really interesting way to kind of start off the episode to trace it back to the very beginning of the first conversation that Katie and I had. And immediately, right off the bat, one of the first things that I recognized was how comfortable I felt speaking with Katie and Helen. And I remember I've referenced this quote a couple of times from The Science of Stuck, but it's something that has really stuck with me since I read it. And it's something along the lines of, trauma is what we hold inside in the absence of an empathetic witness. And I remember from the first time ever reading that, thinking to myself, that is incredibly accurate and a way of describing trauma that I hadn't encountered before, and yet it really and truly resonated with me, especially being in the earlier stages of my healing journey, where I was finally now able to start to understand a lot of these negative behaviors or these toxic traits that I had experienced and even picked up on myself. Now I'm starting to become aware of these things. I'm trying to unlearn them. And I realized that I was only able to do that in a safe environment, in the presence of an empathetic witness. And that applies also to just speaking openly and honestly and being vulnerable about our own experiences, about our emotions. And I think that's one of the things that Katie and Helen do so wonderfully, is they create such a safe space for their audience, for their listeners, to really start to address these more difficult topics in their own life, in their own experience, to start tracing these things back and maybe bring these more hurtful memories to the surface so that they can better understand how they've shaped them today, right? How they inform their decisions and how they can start to let go of these things and actually heal from them moving forward. And I think what was especially different, I guess, about this feeling, it was unique to me, but it was extremely comforting. And I think the reason that I felt that way was because growing up in a narcissistic family with a controlling parent, you're not encouraged to speak honestly about how you're feeling. You're not encouraged to develop your own opinions or to be vulnerable. And I think, those rare times when maybe something that you're truly feeling does slip out, there's a very good chance that that thing might be weaponized and used against you. And so very quickly, you learn to not share any of your vulnerabilities or your insecurities, things that you have a hard time dealing with, because you're not putting it out there into a safe space. You are giving people around you who are going to manipulate you ammunition to just absolutely take you down and devastate you whenever they see fit. I remember feeling a lot throughout my childhood like I could never really voice how I was truly feeling because I never wanted to upset my parent. I never wanted to be the center of attention, and I certainly didn't want to reveal things that could later on be used to hurt me. And I think, there's also a part of it that comes into play where when you have a narcissistic parent, they don't often validate your experience, right? They oftentimes do the opposite, right? They gaslight you. They make you doubt your perception of reality because they want your words, your actions, your beliefs to better suit this narrative that they've created in their own minds. And so there's a real lack of validation in a relationship with a narcissist. And that was something that was so present in my conversation with Katie and Helen. Anything I would say, I felt like I was saying to two people who were listening. They were empathetic. And, if I was speaking about an experience of mine that they had insight into, they could comment on that in a helpful way. Nothing that I ever said was weaponized or used against me. It was such a safe and compassionate space. And I think it is so essential to healing to exist in a space like that, to create a safe environment. And I think that's why therapy is so helpful for so many people. Not only do you get the professional opinion and information, right? The knowledge behind their titles and all of the insight that they've gained from the research that they've done, all of the work that they have put in, all of the different people and stories that they've encountered, right? And helped people to work through. There's so much perspective in that that's really hard to find anywhere else. And so I felt like I could dive into anything, and I knew that whatever I was going to receive in return was going to be helpful in one way or another. And at the very least, even if there was no real solution offered, it was, remember to hold yourself with care and compassion in these moments, right? To validate those feelings. And that it kind of ties back into what I was talking about earlier with immediately feeling defensive when I got that initial message, like this might be something negative. It's important for me in a moment like that, not to just write that off and be like, oh, that's so stupid. There's no reason that I should feel like that. Of course there's a reason, right? And I know what that reason is. And in recognizing that, I'm validating my younger self and my experience, right? And my emotions and the skills that I developed to help get me through that really tumultuous time. And so one of the first things that we got into in my letter was toxic positivity. And for anyone who hasn't listened to Katie and Helen's podcast, their format typically follows a letter that is either read aloud by a guest or they read a letter from a viewer that one of their audience members has submitted. And so they'll read through the letter and they'll break it down and address certain points throughout the letter, maybe a question at the end. And so one of the first things that I talked about was how growing up, positivity was preached in my house in a really twisted sort of way. An example being when I was younger, I was a bit of a picky eater. I didn't like a lot of foods. And so if I had finished my dinner and I left just a little something on the plate that I really didn't like and I was forced to eat it and I was upset about it, I'm talking 5 or younger. I was upset about it. Maybe I was crying, right? I was having a little bit of a fit. Later on, I would be shown pictures of starving children to show me just how good I had it and how so many people had it so much worse that I had nothing to be upset about. And what this does is it makes you feel like anything shy of the sky falling down is not reason enough to feel any kind of sadness or any sort of negative emotion. And so not only are you already encouraged when you grow up with a narcissistic parent to suppress a lot of your true opinions about other people, about experiences, about the behavior that you're enduring, but you're also pressured to not ever feel sad or upset about anything, regardless of how you truly feel. If it hurts you, if it's something that you're confused about, any sort of negative emotion that's triggered by something that your narcissistic parent considers to be trivial is invalid. And so you're already suppressing a lot of your true feelings, and now you feel like you can't be upset ever about anything. And if you ever do actually feel upset about something that your parent deems minor, you feel really guilty about that. But it makes me think about, what if everyone walked around and thought to themselves, well, there are other people in the world that have it better than I do, that are happier than me. So it's really not right for me to feel any kind of happiness. That would be awful. And yet it's the same exact mentality where, other people have it worse than I do. And I'm sure other people are sadder than I am sometimes, but that doesn't make it any less okay for me to feel sadness. It's all relative. And so whatever's going on in my life that might be hurtful, it's okay for me to sit with those more negative emotions and to process them instead of just pretending like they don't exist. You can't ignore these emotions and these feelings, right? Your body is going to hold on to them until you face them and you process them. And I think that's why it's so overwhelming sometimes when you finally break out of a narcissistic relationship, because you're dealing with years sometimes of suppressed emotions and they don't go away. And that's something that I didn't know. I didn't know that if I tucked all of these things away and I didn't talk about them and I didn't entertain them at all, that they would still be there when I was in a safe environment, that they would start making their way to the surface. And whether I liked it or not, I was going to have to face them. We also talked a bit about toxic positivity relating to, I guess, the role that so many of us fulfill in a narcissistic family dynamic. For me, I know I mentioned before feeling like I was the golden child, that I fulfilled that role. But after having a conversation with Katie and Helen, I think I received more so golden child treatment. I felt often like the emotionally mature member of the family. I felt like I was the best at handling these more complex emotions. I was always more driven to try to resolve an issue and to move on. And so when you fulfill that role of the person to diffuse arguments, of the mediator for so long, where it's like, if anyone can solve this, right, it's me. it can be really hard to let that go when you finally do make the decision to stand up to a narcissist or to break out of an unhealthy relationship. I think it's so common for people to hold out hope that things are going to change. If I say or if I do this thing, then they'll see reason in it and everything will get better. And while it's important to be hopeful, it's also important to be realistic, especially for yourself. That was something that I had to come to terms with at one point or another, where I am only one part of this equation. And so no matter how much time and energy and effort I put in to fixing this relationship, to mending this really damaged dynamic, if the other half of this equation first isn't aware of the damage, and second isn't willing to put in that same level of time and energy and effort, then no matter what I do, we will never get there. And I think this was made exponentially harder just by feeling still like I was that person, like I was the most emotionally mature, like I was the one, if anyone in the world could fix this, that could actually fix it. But you can't change people. People only change when they want to change in their own time. I feel like I was kind of forced to let go of what would have been that more toxic positivity right around the time that I met my husband. And this, when I spoke to Katie and Helen, this particular instance is kind of what made me realize that maybe I had been the scapegoat all along. Maybe I never actually was the golden child. When I met my husband, that was the first time that I ever stood and stuck with my no, right? I said no and I put my foot down and I did not pick it back up. Every other time up until then, whatever it was that I wanted or I wanted to do, it was easy enough for me to just kind of roll over and sacrifice that thing and let it go because it wasn't worth the flack that I would get if I really clung to it. And so this was the first time that I really held my no. And that made my position increasingly clear. And that allowed me to let go of some of that toxic positivity. And we did get into mine and my husband's relationship a bit, which was really interesting. It was a lot of fun to talk about. And, the reason that I think it's important to bring these things up, I was 21 years old when I moved out of my parents' house, when I first started to heal. And I don't even truly feel like I was at the start of my healing journey until maybe about 8 months ago. I was out of that environment, but I was completely naive to narcissism and all of the control and manipulation and terms that go along with it. I had no idea, I guess, of the side effects, the offshoots of such an intense level of control and manipulation until recently. But I was a young adult when I was first in a healthy relationship, when I first experienced a healthy relationship and gained some perspective for the first time. And I don't think that's uncommon for children of narcissistic parents, especially who grow up in a more controlling environment and don't have a lot of opportunities to go out with their friends or, to have a boyfriend in 8th grade or high school to figure out who they are and to experiment and try new things. And so I think for so many of us in our early or late 20s, even into our early 30s, if we are being introduced to a healthy relationship for the first time, it might be really jarring and scary. And that's why I wanted to talk a little bit more about this topic, which we touched on in the episode. It's so common, I think, when you grow up with a controlling parent to seek, whether consciously or subconsciously, similar treatment from other partners, whether it's friends or romantic partners. And I've heard from a lot of people online how they grew up with a narcissistic parent and then they had a narcissistic partner for however many years. And it wasn't until they broke out of those relationships that they realized the connection between the two. And it makes perfect sense. If you grow up and you are receiving love and care from your parents in the form of control and manipulation, why wouldn't you seek that from a partner that you want love and care from? It seems only natural. That's all you're used to, especially if you didn't have any opportunity to gain any kind of outside perspective. And so it's really important to break out of those narcissistic familial relationships, I think, before you move into new friendships or romantic relationships, to understand the kind of behavior that's healthy and that's unhealthy. What are your boundaries? What is your place in a relationship? And what do you expect from a healthy partner? What does that look like? And when you haven't had that time, it can be really uncomfortable and scary and confusing to be in a healthy relationship. And I think that was the case with me. I went from living with my parents to moving in with my husband, who at the time was my boyfriend of 4 months. And so I never had a time where I was living alone or with a girlfriend where I was able to just experience the world by myself, for myself, outside of a lot of that control and manipulation that I had grown so used to. And so there was this stark contrast between what I was expecting and what I was actually experiencing. And I later realized that I was projecting a lot of the toxicity that I had endured throughout my childhood onto my current relationship. I was suspicious of everything. I convinced myself of secrecy and dishonesty around every corner. I took no one and nothing at their word. And, all the while, my mind was consistently pumping out these really terrifying hypothetical scenarios that preyed on my deepest rooted fears and insecurities. And so all of these things are happening in the very early stages of a really healthy relationship. But because I hadn't realized how unhealthy the behavior that I had been exposed to for the first 20 years of my life was, I didn't know that I could be expecting anything different. I didn't know that love and care could take on different forms. And so there were a lot of times, earlier on in our relationship that I struggled, that I felt incredibly overwhelmed and frustrated and uncomfortable. And I think I've told this story briefly before, but the first time I ever apologized to my husband was such an eye-opening experience for me. It's similar to that defensiveness that we talked about earlier. For the first 20 years of my life, in light of any kind of controversy, I had to kind of understand what my stance was, and I had to stick to it. Any sign of uncertainty was weaponized and used against me. If I apologized or if I misspoke, if I admitted any kind of wrongdoing or took responsibility for something that I did, that was always a negative. I was attacked for that, and it was used as justification that, maybe I was a bad person or I was making the wrong decisions, or because I made this mistake, then I shouldn't be allowed to do this thing because clearly I can't be trusted. And so I was always so fearful of apologizing, in addition to the fact that I grew up never expecting an apology from anyone. It was always just you yell and then they yell and then I'll be sitting here and maybe I'm upset by it, but if the next day the sun comes up and you're feeling okay about it, then guess what? I've moved on too. No need for resolution or any kind of apology. And so apologies were really foreign to me and they were really uncomfortable and scary. And so immediately I would become defensive in light of any kind of controversy. But there was a time when, relatively early in our relationship, we had a bit of a tiff and there was no denying it. I was in the wrong and I felt like there was nothing that I could do besides apologize. I didn't want to keep lying to myself and to my partner. And so I very reluctantly apologized. I was so uncomfortable, but it was met with understanding and empathy, and we moved on immediately. And that was really eye-opening for me, having this realization that I don't have to be perfect to be loved. I'm human, and I'm flawed, and I make mistakes, and that's okay. It's not always going to be used against me because the people in my life are not always going to be power hungry and looking to manipulate me in any way they can. And so that was a really difficult thing for me to unlearn in a healthy relationship. But obviously moving forward, taking responsibility and apologizing is really beneficial, right? You've got a common goal of resolution. And my husband was also the first person to really introduce me to direct communication. having grown up in that kind of environment, there was a lot of passive aggressive behavior. I developed this level of hypervigilance where I was always aware of everything that was going on. Having played the role of the child who felt more like a third parent, I was always trying to diffuse situations before they even got off the ground. And if anything did happen, I was going to step in as the mediator. And so I was always walking on eggshells, and I was always trying to predict and prevent any sort of negativity or emotional reaction. And I applied that same level of hypervigilance to my relationship with my husband unknowingly. And I also expected that same hypervigilance in return. And so if my husband was a little too quiet for too long, right? First of all, I was always paying attention to him and everything that he was doing and the tone that he was using, how he was feeling. If he was quiet for a little too long, I was wary that something was wrong. Maybe I said or did something to upset him. If he was frustrated, I felt like it was my responsibility to try to make him feel better or try to help him with whatever it was he was frustrated on. And I think, the reason being, I was upset that if he continued to feel frustrated, if he couldn't figure it out, then there was going to be a huge emotional blow up and the rest of the day or the night would be completely ruined. And I didn't realize for a long time that I was feeling this way because that's just what I had grown used to. That was the behavior that I grew up around. And so I was projecting that onto this new, fresh, healthy relationship in my life. And I was upset when I didn't receive that same level of hypervigilance from my partner. But looking back, it's really healthy that he didn't display those tendencies. He was actually the first one to introduce me to any kind of direct communication, I guess bringing it back around to my initial point. So I know now that if I'm upset about anything or if I'm feeling frustrated, if I need anything from my husband, I can directly communicate that to him. If he says something that upsets me, I don't have to just be quiet and distant and cold and passive aggressive and wait for him to notice that my vibe has changed, right? And then for him to try to address the situation and do anything and everything to try to make me feel better. And I know that I don't have to do the same for him in return. If he's upset about something or if he needs something from me, he will communicate that directly to me. And that was something that, again, in the beginning was sort of uncomfortable. I didn't know how to state directly how I was feeling, especially if I was pointing out something that someone else did that made me feel any kind of negative emotion. I thought I would be blamed for that. I thought whoever I was saying that to, my husband, would be extremely upset by that. But he wasn't, because this is a healthy relationship. And I think one of the last ways that it was really difficult for me to let go of that toxic behavior and not apply it to my healthy relationship with my husband, and we talked about this in the episode also, is accountability. It was hard for me to take responsibility, obviously, for things that I had done wrong, for mistakes that I had made. But if I was feeling really big emotions, if I was really insecure or really jealous or really frustrated, and I was overcome with emotion, I was clearly visibly upset, and I was explaining this to my husband, all the while the behavior that I'm explaining, maybe the justification for this emotion, is really negative and really toxic, which looking back, it absolutely was. But in the moment, I didn't know that. I was kind of blind to that. And so if I was visibly upset and I was trying to convince my husband of my point of view, which again was wrong, and he wouldn't give in, and he would say to me, no, like that is not the right way to feel, that you're not doing the right thing here. I would be so frustrated and overwhelmed because I had appeased my narcissistic parent for 20 years of my life, where if they were really upset about something, if they were really frustrated, all I felt that I could do at a certain point was just give in, right? Because it's like they're clearly so upset, there's no reasoning here, and I don't want them to be any more upset, right? I want to kind of move on and make this a more positive experience if I can. So I'm just going to agree, I'm going to appease you, and yes, I see your side of things, it's okay. And when I didn't receive that from my husband, it was really confusing for me because I was like, you love me, you care about me, we're in a relationship, and yet you're not appeasing me. You're not just saying yeah, okay, I understand, I can see your side of things, that's okay. And I'm really thankful that he didn't, because the behavior that I was displaying was not healthy. It's not the kind of person that I want to be. It was a direct reflection of so much of the behavior that I experienced when I was growing up. And that accountability was necessary for me to start to unlearn a lot of these unhealthy behaviors. But that didn't make it any less uncomfortable. I was forced to face insecurities and fears and question everything about the way that I felt, about emotions and reactions and experiences. What were my opinions on things? And that process of deconstruction, all while being held accountable for your behavior, it was heavy. It was exhausting, but I'm so glad that I went through it all, that I put the time in to let go of a lot of those things and to move forward in a really healthy way. And I guess I just want to say that there is absolutely hope out there for everyone who has been in or experienced a controlling or a narcissistic relationship. You do not need to seek out those same tendencies in a new partner. You shouldn't. It's important for you to understand what your boundaries are, what your place in a relationship looks like, what do you expect from a healthy partner, and to apply that moving forward. And I also kind of want to shout out all of the really patient, communicative partners that are helping so many of us heal from these relationships, who are giving us perspective and allowing us to heal for the first time. I think there's such a special bond that happens when you encounter a healthy relationship for the first time, and you realize that you're in a safe environment and that the love you're receiving is unconditional. So whether you're having a really great day and you feel like, I'm taking on a lot of these really healthy behaviors, I feel good, I feel like I can tackle this, or maybe you're reverting back to some of that toxicity just out of habit, but you're still trying. No matter what kind of day you're having, you're going to be loved because you're loved for who you are, not what you do, not what you can offer that person. And I'm sure it's really difficult on both ends. I know that it's difficult on both ends, but I just want to say to be patient with yourself and to be patient with your partner. And a shout out to every single person who is putting in the time and energy to start to heal and who is standing by a partner who is healing, because it is not a linear process. It's not easy, but it's worth it. And if you can get through that with a partner, there is nothing that can get in between you. All in all, I had a phenomenal time talking with Katie and Helen. I am a massive fan of everything that they're doing, all of the work that they're doing on social media, the awareness that they're raising about narcissism. It's so necessary. It's really important. And I was so honored that they thought of me to have me on as a guest. And it's got me thinking about being a guest on other podcasts. If anyone is listening to this who, has some favorite mental health or healing podcasts, let me know what they are. If you'd like to see me on them, I would love to reach out to more people who are having this same conversation and, to offer up my perspective and to gain some from them also. So. I said so many times there. So with that, I think that's about all the time that I've got for this week's episode, but I was so happy to kind of recap what Katie and Helen and I talked about. And if you have any other questions about the episode, please leave those in the comments or head over to TikTok and ask me there. If you haven't listened to the episode, make sure to look up Insight, Exposing Narcissism. My episode is episode 99, and it's available on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, just about everywhere that It's Not Normal is offered. So thanks to everyone for tuning in, and I will be back next week with a new episode of It's Not Normal.